This morning, we will be back in the book of 1 Thessalonians. This is Paul's first epistle to the church of Thessalonica, potentially even the first letter Paul writes to any church. If you're using one of the Pew Bibles, 1 Thessalonians 2 is on page 717. Today we are going to cover Hallmarks of Gospel Ministry. Hallmarks of Gospel Ministry, following up last week's message on a church worth talking about. And so, if you're there, if you'll follow along with me, I'm going to read verses 1 through 12 of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Paul says, "For yourselves, brethren, know our interests in unto you, that it was not in vain, but even after that we had suffered before and were shamefully entreated, as ye know at Philippi, we were bold in our God to speak unto you the gospel of God with much contention. For our excitation was not of deceit, nor of uncleanness, nor in guile, but we were allowed of God to be put in trust with the gospel. Even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God which trieth our hearts. For neither at any time used we flattering words, as ye know, nor a cloak of covetousness, God is witness. Nor of men sought we glory, neither of you, nor yet of others, when we might have been burdensome as the apostles of Christ, but we were gentle among you, even as a nurse cherisheth her children. So, being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls, because ye were dear unto us. For ye remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable unto any of you. We preached unto you the gospel of God. Ye are witnesses. And God also, how holily and justly and unblameably we behaved ourselves among you that believe. As ye know, how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you, as a father doth his children, that ye would walk worthy of God, who hath called you unto his kingdom and glory." And that is the 12 verses we will cover today. Does anyone recognize this building? Anyone recognize this building and know what this building is? I didn't expect so. The original building is from the 1300s, and its successor is from the 1600s. And both of those have been destroyed, and this is the third iteration of Goldsmiths Hall. Goldsmiths Hall. For over 700 years, it has sat at the same location, Foster Lane and Gresham Street in London. It's home to you'll see the coat of arms there for the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths that was established in 1327. I know worshipful is an old English word, not worship in the sense that we think of today. But for the past 700 years, this company and this hall have been used to research and to teach goldsmithing and silversmithing, as well as this serves as the location where they test precious metals to verify the purity of those metals. And back in the day, 700 some years ago, when they tested the metals and they verified the purity, it would get a hall mark on it. A goldsmith's hall mark. So hall for Goldsmiths Hall, and then a mark that they put on it to say, we've tested it, this is pure gold, or this is whatever. Eventually, those words, hallmark, became one word, hallmark. And its meaning took on not simply purity of gold and silver and such of the like, but it became a meaning of a sign of authenticity, a distinguishing feature or quality. From that word, I want to take in its current meaning, I want to derive the title for today's message, which is Hallmarks of Gospel Ministry. In other words, the things that are distinguishing features, the signs of authenticity for a gospel ministry. And maybe even we might narrow it down further if we wanted to say the gospel ministry of the ministers themselves. The big idea of this text today is Paul recounts his and Silas's gospel ministry as being characterized by boldness, honesty, integrity, charity, and exemplification. And as an aside, I'll note that this is not an exhaustive list that Paul gives here. If we were to mine the scriptures, we could locate many other hallmarks of gospel ministry, many other distinguishing features of what a true gospel ministry should look like. But this is the ones that are before us today. Now, with that being the big idea, I'll tell you up front, this is the applications I want us to consider. Personally, is the way I handle the gospel itself and how I live my life characterized by boldness, honesty, integrity, and charity, and is it worthy of imitation? That is the personal takeaway for each one of us here today, including myself. The second application is more corporate, in a sense. And that is the way our church's leadership handles the gospel and the truths thereof in keeping with the example of Paul and Christ. Because if I am not following the guidelines and the examples, especially of Paul, but even more especially of Christ, then something is wrong. And so those are the two applications I would like us to consider and to have in your mind as we work through this today, because we're going to work through it and then we're going to end with communion. And so we're not really, per se, going to return to and delve out those applications too much more. So, what are the hallmarks of gospel ministry? The first is that a hallmark of gospel ministry is boldness in spite of opposition. Boldness in spite of opposition. From verses 1 and 2, Paul mentions that their entry to this church was not in vain. Now, if you remember, they only spent 3 weekends in this city before they had to leave because of the persecution that came upon them, the opposition that they faced. But Paul says, I know we only spent a few weeks there, but it wasn't in vain. Now, that word vain, we typically translate as empty. The Expositor's Bible Commentary translates it. They prefer a definition more akin to failure. In other words, Paul says, we came to you, we only spent 3 weeks with you, but you know, as well as we know, it wasn't meaningless. It wasn't a failure. Though it was only 3 weekends, though we were only there 3 weeks, there was success in those 3 weeks. Obviously, because what do we see? There's a church in Thessalonica that if they had failed, there would be no church there. Paul goes on to talk about how they entered from Philippi. Now, you'll remember Acts 16, Paul and Silas are journeying, and they come across a woman begins following them. And she begins ministering and talking about them. She is possessed with an evil spirit. And they throw the evil spirit out of her. They cast it out of her. And as a result, her masters catch them, drag them to prison, drag them to the rulers of the city of Philippi, because they realized, hey, we just lost our source of money because this girl was going around doing all this stuff, making us money. And the rulers of the city have them beaten, and they have them cast into prison there in Philippi. And you probably remember the most significant portion of that time in Philippi is that they begin to sing and pray in the jail at midnight. And then an earthquake happens, and the doors open. And the keeper of the prison pulls out his sword to kill himself because all his prisoners have been able to escape. And Paul cries out, "Don't fear not, we're all here. We're all here. We didn't leave." And then that jailer is miraculously converted, and his house hears and they believe. A few days later, after that event, Paul and Silas leave Philippi and they come to Thessalonica. And we would think potentially that maybe, having experienced what they just did in Philippi, maybe they would lay low for a couple weeks. Calm down, let the heat off, maybe get the law off their back for a little bit and relax. But no, what does Paul do? What did Paul say he did when he got there? He went straight into the synagogue and began to preach Christ, how he was crucified. And then he does it for the second week. And then he did it for a third week. And thus, because of those 3 weeks, what do they face? Great more persecution in Thessalonica, as we read in Acts 17 last week. See, the gospel, the good news of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, it's so important that it grabs a hold of the heart in such a way that those who believe the gospel of Jesus, they are compelled to share it. It's almost like they can't not share it. It just becomes a part of, they almost become like the vegans of society. How do you, the old age-old statement is, how do you know if someone is a vegan? Don't worry, they'll tell you. You don't have to ask. They'll just share that information with you. Or they're a vegetarian. They'll just share that information. Well, the gospel of Jesus Christ is a little bit like that in some respects, in that we feel compelled. It flows out of us. The truth flows out of us. Even if it means our own demise. Even if it means persecution. Even if it means we face opposition. We're willing to speak the truth. See, the difference between Paul and those who truly believe and those who don't really truly believe, who just say stuff, who are doing it out of personal motives, the difference between the two groups is that those who don't truly believe the gospel of Jesus often fold when opposition comes. They give in. They shut down. But true gospel ministry is bold in the face of opposition. It refuses to be silenced. Now, I understand, and to be clear, there are a lot of varying degrees as to what we could say, what is persecution, what is opposition, and that's a whole rabbit hole in and of itself that we could dive into and say, well, is this giving in? Is this giving in? And we can work all that out if we wanted to. But the long-term evidence of true gospel ministry, a distinguishing feature, a hallmark of true gospel ministry, is continued boldness to share the gospel no matter the opposition that is faced. Paul then spends the majority of his time in this section talking about the second hallmark, and that is this. Number 2, a hallmark of gospel ministry is exhortation with honesty, integrity, and charity. A hallmark of gospel ministry is exhortation with honesty, integrity, and charity. Paul says in verse 3 that our exhortation was not of deceit. And what he means by this is not that they were trying to deceive the Thessalonians. Rather, the point Paul is making here, it wasn't that we were deceived. In other words, Paul says, Silas and I are not in error. We have not been deceived. We have not bought or been sold a bill of goods that now we're trying to resell to somebody else. We have not been self-deluded. No, we have received the truth, and we're giving you the truth. We have not been deceived. And then he goes on and he says, nor was there uncleanness. Now this one seems somewhat out of place because this word uncleanness is often translated and used within the context of sexual immorality. Paul's usage here likely indicates to us the kind of opposition they were facing in Thessalonica, even after they left. And that is, one of the reasons this accusation would come is because it was very common in those days that religious traveling ministers of the various Greek and Roman religious practices and even others would come in and they would share their gospel, but they would do so that they could have sex with men and women. And that to bring them in, that way they could take advantage of them. And that's likely what people in Thessalonica were telling the church at Thessalonica. Oh, Paul and Silas only did what they did because they wanted to sleep with people. And Paul says, we were not deluded, and we did not come in with any pretext of planning on engaging in sexual immorality. And the third thing he says is, nor in guile. This is the word Paul uses. This is in regard to trying to deceive people. Paul says, we received the truth and we were sharing the truth, not for personal pleasures, nor were we trying to deceive others into following us for our own profit. Rather, as verses 4 and 5 say, he says, we didn't use dishonesty or greed as motives. Rather, they used the fact that they were trusted with the truth of the gospel and that God was going to judge them based on how they handled that gospel. Then in verse 6, he speaks of their integrity. They weren't trying to gain power from the gospel. And intentionally, what Paul explains here is they didn't go to Thessalonica to get the Thessalonians to support them financially. Instead, he goes on to talk about how we intentionally chose not to make a living off of the gospel. And as we understand it, Paul was likely a tent maker, and every town that he went into, he worked day in, night out, in order to provide for himself and his companions. And they labored and they travailed night and day, as he said, in order that we aren't chargeable to you. This is what he'll say in a moment. Technically, Paul says, we could have been burdensome. We could have required you to pay us, because those who preach the gospel, Scripture says elsewhere, should be, I forget the wording, but they should be paid for their duties. But Paul says we didn't do that. Why? Because it could have been taken in the wrong light. Could have been misunderstood that they were just trying to get rich off of these people. Instead, Paul uses this example in verse 7. He says, we were more like a mother nursing her children. Now, I know this says a nurse cherisheth her children. The translational error, if you will, or the translational understanding should be more in line with a mother who nurses her children. And the reality is a nursing mother is gentle. Because why? Well, the child's young. The child's immature. The mother could take full advantage of this baby, this child. The mother could raise that child such that the child thinks it is its mother's slave. They could train up the child in such that the child glories their mother, not in a good biblical sense, but rather they worship their mother as the superior person in life. That's a possibility, but the gentleness of a mother is such that because of her love, her charity for her child, she denies herself to nurture her child, even going so far as being willing to die for her child to live. And Paul and Silas, their explanation here is, we were so affectionately desirous of you. We loved you so much. We imparted the gospel to you. We could have come in demanding money. We could have come in demanding you take care of us, because that's those who make their living of the gospel should be paid back for doing so. We could have come in and said that, but instead we came to you and said, no. We love you so much. We have received the truth. We love the truth so much. We want to share the truth with you. We don't want payment from you. We are going to give you the gospel. And so much so, he says in verse 8, that we even poured out of our own souls. We were willing to spend and be spent for you, so that you might understand the gospel. We can see how these hallmarks of gospel ministry are even giving us very telltale signs within our own world today. How many churches are there that are presented as gospel ministries, but in reality they are led by men and women who seek to build kingdoms to themselves, who do so for sex, for profit, for power, demanding churches pay them outrageous sums of money, instead of nurturing, they abuse and take advantage of the people in the churches. They never pour themselves out for the people, but they always required their congregants to pour themselves out for the preacher. And based on what Paul says here in Thessalonians, that's completely backwards for how gospel ministry should work. But if you take that description there, signs of corrupted ministries today, and you look at a lot of the churches and religious organizations of our world today, you'll find out they're not really practicing true gospel ministry. Unfortunately. Paul's conclusion comes in verses 9 through 12, and there he points out another hallmark of gospel ministry. And that is, a hallmark of gospel ministry is exemplification worthy of imitation. Exemplification, an example, worthy of imitation. 3 times in these 4 verses, Paul says these words: ye remember, ye are witnesses, ye know. In other words, when you hear those things from outside, when you hear the opposition, when you hear the persecution, when you hear those Jews from the synagogue, or the Greek and Roman deities, those priests of those lines of religious study, when you hear all of them coming and saying, Paul and Silas were doing this only for power, they were doing this only for money, they were doing this only for sex, they were doing this for all these things. When you hear all of them saying those things, don't let them twist the truth. Instead, stop, look back, recall what actually happened. Remember what you know is true. In this case, the truth was, Paul and Silas, as he says, we labored and travailed day and night so that we would not be chargeable to you. In other words, we paid our own way. Though, he uses the word here, so that we would not be chargeable unto any of you. We could even say it like this: so that you couldn't accuse us of taking advantage of you, we paid our own way. Now, the reality is, technically, people can accuse someone. But the reality of Paul and Silas's character and their behavior would make it obvious that that accusation is not true. In verse 10, he says, recall how they lived there. You're witnesses. And God also, how holily and justly and unblameably we behaved ourselves among you that believe. Again, they were only there for 3 weeks, but what Paul says is, we lived holy lives above reproach. We lived justly. We didn't violate the laws of the land. We lived unblameably. Again, not that they couldn't be accused, but rather that any accusation brought against them would be revealed as false. Paul says, we lived exemplary lives when we were there. Then in verse 11, he says, ye know. Ye know how we exhorted you, how we comforted and charged you, every one of you. And this time he changes examples. Like a mother nurtures her child, now it's how a father instructs his children. What does he do? The father imparts truth and knowledge, wisdom and understanding to his children, with the goal, Paul says in verse 12, that ye would walk worthy of God. All in all, Paul and Silas's manner of conduct, the example they portrayed, again, in only 3 weeks, was worthy to be imitated. So that these people in Thessalonica would be able to look at how they lived, again, for only 3 weeks, and imitate their lifestyle, because by imitation of their lifestyle, it would be walking worthy of God. So too today, those at the front of the church, if you will, we must lead lives that are worthy of being imitated. Not because they are something, not because I am something, but because the one we serve is worthy. He is something. The way Paul says this in 1 Corinthians to the Corinthian church, which is where he's actually writing from, is this: "Be ye followers of me, even as I also am of Christ." Interestingly, that the Thessalonians were to imitate Paul as Paul imitates Christ is the connection within 1 Thessalonians 2 to communion. Because Paul is imitating Christ, who is the one we should imitate. We might then ask, well, how was Christ to be imitated? Well, in keeping with this passage, Christ was bold in the face of opposition. Whether he was facing outsiders, whether he was facing the Jewish religious leaders of that day, or whether he was spending 40 days in the desert with the devil himself, tempting him, Christ was bold, bringing the truth of Scripture to the forefront and presenting that. Secondly, Christ's exhortation of his disciples and any others that he came in contact with, he was always honest. When you go through the Gospels, what do you find? Christ was honest. His character, his integrity was superior. He lived a life that was imitatable. And not only that, he did both of those things with charity. He loved people. How many times do we find in the scriptures that it goes and seeing the blind man, or seeing the man with leprosy, or seeing this person, he had compassion. Compassion born out of a heart of love. And then finally, Christ was our example to imitate. In this way, that he literally poured out his own body. Literally poured out his own blood, that we might know the forgiveness and remission of sins. In Paul's case, he was merely imitating Christ. Paul was literally pouring out his body in the beatings, in the abuse that Paul suffered over and over and over again over the course of his ministry. He literally was pouring out his own self to get the gospel to the churches, or to those who had never been churched, if you will. He was literally pouring out his body. Why? Because Christ poured out himself, literally and fully, for Paul, the one who stood there holding the garments of Stephen as they stoned him to death. And Paul says, of all people, he saved me. And now I want to tell you how he saved me. And he goes on and lives a life, an exemplary life, worthy of imitation, so that all these people could walk worthy of God.